Hello everyone, welcome to period 7 of the APUSH curriculum. One note before we get going on the progressive movement here is that for historical period 7, I want you to watch these movies not in the order of the concept outline. So at the beginning of every one of these videos, there's going to be a number, and I want you to watch them in order of those numbers instead of just going in order of the 711, 712, etc. Okay, so please pay attention to that. I think it works better to go in a more chronological way here because they try to go thematic, correct? But their way of doing it thematic means that we're talking about eras that, haven't happened chronologically, and then we have to go way back in history, then way forward and way back, and it's a little confusing. So this is the one time where we're going to go out of order. This is the first video that you are watching, all about the progressive movement. So basically what we're talking about here are the responses after industrialization, urbanization, immigration, all these things that happened during the late 19th century. We're looking at how the government and society starts to respond to those changes, hoping to, change them for the better. Because industrialization changed us and brought about some great technology, improved our economy, but it also had some pretty unintended consequences and negative results as well. Here we go. Alright, so what we're focusing on for this first slide has to do with people within society who are responding. So reformers, who are often journalists, often kind of middle and upper class people, mostly women, who are trying to change society through their individual action to affect the government and to affect change. So I want you to notice for this is not about the government responding yet. This is about people responding to the changes of industrialization. All right, one group of these people are those journalists mentioned on the left, these muckrakers. Okay, what they wanted to do is expose to the public all sort of the ills and the problems going on in this era of industrialization. Now, what this term means is if you look at, it's basically two words. It's a compound word, muck and raker. So rake like rake like you do the leaves. Muck is like that one Pokemon, and he's like all ugly and purple and gross. It's just kind of like really gross stuff. The idea is that they're going to rake in all the horrible, gross things in society, collect it, and then present it to the public saying, look what is going on. Why is this acceptable? Why aren't we doing anything about it? So let me give you a few examples of who some muckrakers were. One was a guy named Jacob Riis. He himself was a Danish immigrant, and he basically took a lot of photos of what he called how the other half lives. So conditions lived in by the working poor in tenement houses, in sweatshops, the conditions in what they worked and lived, I should say. And what he did is his goal there was to present it to not the owners of the business, they knew what was going on, but to the middle class who was living a much better life and didn't know, so to speak, how the other half lives. Okay, so its effect was it got more people interested in affecting change in society, to reform what was going on that they didn't know before. Other individuals acted in a much more directed way, so not at kind of the widespread problems of poverty and industrialization, but looking at the problem of trusts, looking at the problem of business practices that we studied back in period 6. One of these famous muckrakers here, her name was Ida Tarbell, and she researched and highly investigated John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust. So she wasn't really looking there at, the conditions of the workers or how gross cities were, but rather she was looking at see how this one business has taken over an industry, see how they have so much influence in government that they are preventing our country from being more democratic and working in a way that it was intended to do. So basically saying capitalism is being abused by the capitalists themselves. So she revealed what a big monopoly it was by showing what his business practices were to the public. Now, one of the most famous muckrakers ever, his name was Upton Sinclair, and he wrote a book called The Jungle. So The Jungle is presented as kind of like in novel form about, these characters working in the meatpacking industry in Chicago. But he based it on his own experiences in infiltrating it and seeing what all sort of the, so to speak, how the sausage is made, right? Exactly what's going into the meat, how is the meat treated, what is in the things you are eating. I plan to read some of this in class because it's just too literally and figuratively juicy not to read. Okay, it's fun and disgusting all at the same time. Now here's the thing. He wrote this because he wanted to show to the world, rather to the country, just how poor the working conditions were for the working class. It was like, look what they're expected to do in the meatpacking industry. But here's the thing, he published it, it was very widely read even by President Theodore Roosevelt at the time, and they didn't say, oh, poor working class, they said, what exactly is going into my food? All right? So, there's this old phrase that goes that Upton Sinclair aimed for people's hearts, but he hit them in the stomach, okay? Because they weren't so concerned about other people, but concerned about themselves. So it had an effect, but an unintended effect. What it did is it inspired some new legislation from Congress, the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. So, number one, food had to be labeled honestly, and it had to be inspected by the government to prove that it was safe to eat. So today when you go to the store and you look at kind of all the meat section in the refrigerated area, and it says like USDA approved, this is the early form of that. So that means United States Department of Agriculture. Other things like the FDA, so the federal, I'll look up what it is and put it on a little note on here. I don't know off the top of my head. But they inspect food, they decide what is safe to eat, what is safe for us to consume, and that forces some regulation on companies so that they don't abuse us. Ooh, I have a good story before I move on here. So, if you look to the right, it might be hard to read on your screen, but back in this time, there were a lot of medicine and products that were being made that weren't safe to consume. Okay, and that's where this Pure Food and Drug Act comes in. That's where it says that things have to be labeled honestly. So, if it has some poisonous component that might hurt you, they have to tell you that it's not good for you. They have to say what it actually does. So, if you look there, it says that Sears was selling arsenic complexion wafers. So, we're talking about pills that you would take that contained arsenic, claiming it was going to improve your skin's complexion. Well, if you know arsenic, it's a heavy metal that poisons you slowly over time. Okay, so the Pure Food and Drug Act was looking to regulate this. Some other stuff, there would be a lot of medicines that were just straight up alcohol, so people would get drunk and kind of like be all woozy and not feel their pain, when really it was just treating the symptom and not the problem. Another one is there was some medicine, I know I have some packaging of a picture somewhere, or a picture of a packaging that says they have cocaine toothache pills, okay? So, got a toothache? Take some cocaine, okay? Well, here's the thing. Of course you're not going to feel your toothache. You're not going to feel anything, because you're so high, okay? So, this act of Congress meant that things had to be more honest about products that were being consumed by people. Alright, something else that happens that reformers kind of revealed and showed why changes were necessary in society was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. So a few years ago, our school had a play version of this, so maybe you saw it a few years back. But basically the situation is that we had a building where there was a factory that made shirts. Okay, so there was a lot of scraps of extra fabric being in piles all over the place. There were no regulations that you couldn't like smoke in buildings. There were no regulations about fire escapes or having doors open from the inward or outward, so that if a fire happens, you can get out. Well, what happens here is that the factory was at the top floor of the building, higher than the ladders that the firemen could reach up there. And a fire started, the workers were locked in there because the owners were scared they were going to steal the clothes. A fire starts, they can't get out, and 146 people die. Most of them were young women who were working this type of sweatshop factory situation. Now what happened is, this was a building on the street, and because they couldn't get out, the fire wouldn't go out, right? So lots of people saw this happen, and the New York public was absolutely outraged, and the government in New York was forced to do something about it. So this is the first instance in America where there are new workplace rights and safety laws created within New York City that talk about ladders having to go up higher, doors having to open sort of out of the room instead of into the room, because what happened is the women were throwing themselves against the door, but the door opened in, so it was never actually going to get through the threshold. Okay, so laws are passed. This is kind of like an early progressive movement sort of thing, but just so you know, on top of this, the owners of the building were not found criminally liable in a case brought against them because no laws existed that said that what they were doing was illegal. So what happens? New laws, and so that means in the future, people who don't follow these laws and people die in the process are going to mean they are criminally liable for them. All right. Next up, we're going to talk about once the progressive movement starts to get out of just the social arena with muckrakers and individuals fighting for it, but now, much like with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, government employees, the president, Congress, doing something about it. Okay, so it's one thing to say society's going to try to change things, okay, but the government has to participate too if new laws are going to be in place to make those changes effective and enforceable. Right. Within this time period, we had a few amendments to the Constitution. Remember, the next one before this was the 15th Amendment, giving African American males the right to vote. Of course, that really doesn't happen because of Jim Crow in the South. The 16th Amendment is about a progressive income tax. Progressive means that as your income goes up, so does the percentage of your income that you pay to the government. So, what this represents in the sort of long run of things is a movement away from having tariffs on foreign goods. We are still producing a lot, but our economy has grown, so we move away from tariffs and move more towards taxing individuals in America. Before this, there was no such thing as an income tax. The Supreme Court had ruled it unconstitutional. The only way to change that is an amendment, and that's exactly what happened. Right. Next amendment within kind of the same time period was the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. It's about the direct election of senators. So all the way since when the Constitution got made, senators were not elected by the people themselves. State legislatures, so the people that were in state government, would vote and choose as a group who the state senators would be. So what that meant is now that people directly elect them, popular sovereignty was more being used. So now both the House of Representatives and the Senate have popular sovereignty, the state's voters directly electing them. Right? So we're going to skip the 18th Amendment for now. It deals with prohibition. We'll talk about it in the 1920s. For now, we're going to have to talk about the 19th Amendment too. This is one you have to know. It's mentioned by name of women's suffrage on the left. Voting rights for women in 1920. We've talked about this for a long time, right? We can go all the way back to little baby steps like Republican motherhood, to the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, to the 15th Amendment that split the women's rights movement, created on those organizations fighting just for suffrage for women. Finally, in 1920, it happens. And you just need to realize that it didn't happen for extremely noble reasons. The president at the time was Woodrow Wilson, and he reluctantly endorsed it. So for a long time, he'd put off having a public position on it. But by this point, so many states had already been letting women vote at the state level. There were only a few states left that weren't. We'd just gotten through World War I. Women were participating in work and sort of the war effort. And there was this idea of the time has come, there's so much public pressure, women were starting to protest in front of the White House. This is when protesting in front of the White House actually starts as a thing. So he gives in because of the public pressure. One of the biggest concerns about this from men with a lot of power were that, well, now that another 50% of the population can vote, it's going to radically change who gets elected, what party is in control. Guess what it did? Absolutely nothing. Okay, the voting trends were exactly the same as they were in previous elections, completely disproving the arguments of the anti-suffragettes. All right, so this is where women get the right to vote. All right, some more legislation, not amendments, but acts of Congress. So basically, remember, you need the president to work with that too to make it happen. 1902, this was sort of some action by the president, Teddy Roosevelt. His picture's on the right. And in 1902, there was some coal strikes going on. So workers were trying to unionize, and the owners wouldn't allow them to do so, saying, well, we're just going to fire you and find new people. But industrialization relied so heavily upon coal to power our furnaces, to power our steam engines, to power the machines, that this type of strike would have been detrimental to our economy. So Teddy Roosevelt stepped in. I'm going to talk about him a little later, but what you need to know is he was called the Trust Buster, and he was known for having this very kind of bullish personality where he wasn't going to deal with any BS from these people. Here's what he did. He tricked both sides into coming to an agreement. He invited the workers who wanted to unionize their leaders to the White House, and separately invited the owners of the coal mines to the White House. He pretty much locked them in the room together and said to the owners of the mines, all right, you are going to let these workers unionize so that we can continue to produce coal. Workers, you're going to be sort of willing to negotiate and not make such high demands. And both sides were like, but we want our way. And he said, all right, if you refuse to come to an agreement in this room today, what I am going to do is I'm going to have the federal government seize your mines, owners, and I'm going to use the military to work them so we can still get the coal. Basically, he was going to socialize the mining industry, and the owners are like, huh? And the workers are also like, huh? Because that means they wouldn't have jobs anymore. So guess what? Both sides negotiated. Unions were allowed in this case. And we see, so a little bit of a step forward, the first time that a president is supporting labor unions, and a little bit of regulation of industry as well. Okay, that was Teddy Roosevelt's personality. Something else in 1903, Elkins Act. So this has to do with regulating railroad prices again. I want you to remember that this has happened before. There were those Granger laws. It was very disputed as to who got to set the rates, so the prices for transporting things on the railroad. Was it the railroad companies? Was it the states? Was it the federal government? It's all over the place. What this act of Congress does is it makes a law that says railroads can't offer cheaper rates to larger corporations. There has to be sort of equal application of the law to all companies. So Rockefeller and Carnegie were always going behind the backs of other companies, making deals with the railroads because they were transporting so much. And what they would say to the companies is, well, if you don't decrease our rates, we just won't use your company and you'll lose all your business. So they were kind of extorting the railroad companies to go their way. Elkins Act says they can't do that anymore. All right, 1906, something called the Hepburn Act created the Interstate Commerce Commission. I feel like I've mentioned this before. Oh yeah, because it didn't create the commission, but it said that the government got to set railroad shipping rates and the power to enforce those regulations. So railroads were the transportation method of the interior of the nation at the time. You can see it was a critical issue for the whole economy. All right, next up, 1913, Federal Reserve Act. We get a new banking system. It is a centralized banking system, which we had before, but it changes the ways that it can control the money supply, trying to sort of shift away from the gold standard and get more towards controlling how government bonds are issued. Make a question about this in your point of confusion if you want me to talk about it in class. Banking is super confusing. It's probably better if I explain it in person. All right, another thing, the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. This strengthens the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was made in 1890, but the Sherman Antitrust Act didn't work well because it didn't define what a trust was, and it didn't say what the government was legally allowed to do to break them up. And that's exactly what this did. It defined a trust. It said what can be done by the government to break it up, and it exempted unions from prosecution because it was always unions, almost always unions during the Sherman Antitrust Act that were kind of getting broken up, saying they were interfering with the economy. All right. Now I want you to know that these acts as a whole, they're being passed by Congress, they're being supported by the states. That's how amendments work. They're being supported by the president. Our three progressive presidents are Teddy Roosevelt on the right, William Howard Taft, his chosen successor, and then Woodrow Wilson. From different parties, by the way, but that's how pervasive this progressive movement was, is that both parties supported it, of having greater regulation because of the excesses of industrialization. All right, so shorter one here. One element of the progressive movement had to do with the environment. I've mentioned it a little bit before. There's two different arguments for what should be done to protect the environment. Preservation versus conservation. So, I have the definitions down here. I'll get to them in a second. So, progressive agreed that big business needed to be regulated, but they didn't know how to do that. There were basically different ideas on to what extent they should be regulated and what should be the policies to do it. Like I said, the two major ideas here are preservation versus conservation. Preservation is the idea where the government's going to regulate business practices and what they're allowed to do for the sake of protecting nature. So I mentioned John Muir at another time, I think back in period 6, the Sierra Club. These are the types of things that are looking to just preserve nature. Have it there for tourism, have it there for its natural beauty. And I would say this is kind of the more extreme position when it comes to regulating business, because this means business had no place in the environment. Okay, all those things listed there in yellow I talked about in period 6, but they represent preservation. The other idea is environmental conservation. Okay, conserve means to sort of limit change and to keep what you have. So this meant not protecting nature for nature's sake, but to make sure that as businesses use our natural resources, that they don't overuse them, that there's sort of regulation on how many trees in a forest they're allowed to chop down to allow them to repropagate, how much oil they can get out of the ground, how much fish they can fish. Conservation is more what we see through actions by the government, while preservation is more actions by individuals in society. I say that because within government, there's the idea that they have to find some balance of promoting the economy while also protecting nature, and that's where conservation comes in. Some things here: the U.S. Forest, having a Department of Agriculture, Newland's Reclamation Act. Newland's Reclamation Act decided how are they going to look at some sort of these new lands like swamplands in a way to make them more usable. Theodore Roosevelt was a big supporter of conservation. John Muir, big supporter of preservation. In the past, this has been a SAQ on the AP test, so it's not out of line to ask you to know this one. So conservation protected nature, but applied scientific management to the environment. So remember, scientific management is the idea of you're keeping track of how much is used and deciding what is most efficient. The government is saying we have to conserve things for the future, and we need to keep data to say how much is a reasonable amount to use to keep nature protected for the future, but also promote industrialization at the time. So there were kind of short-term and long-term goals there. For preservation, mostly just long-term goals. All right, that was a quick one because it was a very pointed, directed topic. This last one, you can see, is a little bit longer. What we're dealing with here is kind of the diversity, in a way, over the progressive movement. So if you look at that stuff on the left, it talks about how some progressives supported segregation, others ignored it. So the progressive movement really did not challenge segregation across the country. Other things is some advocated more participation in government. Others said they just wanted to make government more efficient. Those are two leading interpretations of the progressive movement and what it did. We'll talk about immigration restrictions later. I don't think I get to it here. So basically, here we're talking about the politics of the progressive movement, what's going on in government. Now, one of the leading progressive politicians, but one who was really one of the most radical progressives, never became president, just remained a senator, was Robert La Follette from Wisconsin, I should say. And he was called Fighting Bob because he was really kind of spearheading all these movements. He had something called the Wisconsin idea that happened more in his state first before other states picked it up. And it had three aspects to it, trying to encourage more popular participation, so people actually being involved in their local and state governments. The first is the recall election. The recall election means that if the people are electing their leaders, they should also have the power to vote them out of office before their term is up. So this happened in California. Back in, math in my head, back in 2003, we had a governor named Gray Davis who was not very popular. People didn't like his policies. So guess what? It got onto the ballot, a special election of, do you want to remove Gray Davis from the governor? And then options for who should replace him should he be removed. And that's how we had the actor Arnold Schwarzenegger as our governor for years after that, a recall election. Another one is a referendum. So the referendum is kind of like a check on the power of your state legislature. It says that, sure, your state legislatures, through your representatives, decide what your state laws will be. A referendum means you can get it put on the ballot for the people to basically, in a way, veto the legislature's decision. So that means it says, do you want to repeal this act of your state legislature? And if it gets over 50%, it's gone. So it's a sort of check on the power of your state legislative branch. Lastly, the initiative is something that we see every time we have elections in California. The initiative is the idea that individuals can have ideas for laws, and if they get it submitted and get enough signatures, it can go on the ballot, and the whole state populace or voting populace votes on it. So every time you see those proposition signs like no on Prop 1A, yes on Prop 8, no on Prop 48, and making these up. That's what that is. That's the people making the laws rather than the government making the laws. So this spreads to many states. Realize that those three things do not exist at the federal level. They only exist at the state level. So you can't recall like the president or something like that. The people cannot vote to overturn an act of Congress. None of those are in the federal Constitution, but they do exist at the state level. Another thing that happens is states start using something called the direct primary system. So that means basically the people, before voting on who they want to serve in the office, vote within their party who they want the candidate to be. Now, before this, the party would just make a decision. So politicians would already be deciding who the best choice was to get elected. This basically gives people a greater say in who their representative is, because they have the say in who it could be in the election. Both parties still use this system today. We see them always in the lead up to elections in November of deciding within each party who the candidates will be. All right? So, presidential politics of this era. Like I said, we had three progressive presidents. The first was Theodore Roosevelt. He was a rising star in the Republican Party back in the times of William McKinley. All right? So, William McKinley was a supporter of big business like Republicans before him. But the progressive movement and these ideas were starting to spread in both parties with some radical elements. So, what actually happened is McKinley chose Roosevelt because he was very popular in New York, so hopefully to get those votes, but also because most people in government know that the vice president can be a very ineffective office if you don't give them things to do, right? The Constitution doesn't say they have much power. So McKinley chose Roosevelt to limit what he was able to do with actual power. He couldn't do much except vote in the Senate in a tie vote. Guess what happens, though? It backfired. McKinley got assassinated. Teddy Roosevelt, as a result, became the youngest president ever at 42 years of age. You have to be at least 35 to be president. So once he is president, he starts enacting policies that are openly progressive, supporting them within Congress, within acts as the president of what he can do. Like I said, he's known as the trust buster. He had this very robust personality. I'll tell you some funny stories in class. Put that as your point of confusion if you're interested. Right, so one thing Teddy Roosevelt did is, and it kind of backfired on him, is he promised that he wouldn't run for re-election. Okay, he thought it was a noble thing to do. And then when he got re-elected his first time after making this promise, he was like, darn. He realized he was so popular that he could have gotten elected again 4 years later. So he keeps his promise though, but he has 4 years to choose who his successor will be in the Republican Party, knowing that that person will probably get elected off the popularity of Teddy Roosevelt. This was William Howard Taft, the guy in the upper right, mostly known for his rotundity. He was a very large man. Ask me about the bathtub story in class. All right. What happened, though, once he got elected, Teddy Roosevelt left. He's like, I'm done being president. He went on a trip around the world, trekking through the Amazon rainforest, going to Africa on safaris, killing giraffes and stuff like that. And he went on like this world tour. Comes back a year or two later and looks around at what was going on in government because he didn't have any information on it before. And it's like, what on earth has happened to my progressive government? Taft isn't doing the policies I want. So he entered the election of 1912 running against Taft, his own successor, to become president again. So when he did that in 1912, his policy was called New Nationalism. So basically making the progressive movement sort of an institutionalized movement instead of just a popular governmental movement. So this was before women's suffrage had been passed, so he openly supported it. Openly supported even more control of the economy and regulation of it, which Taft had sort of eased off of. So, Teddy Roosevelt did not receive the Republican nomination despite his popularity. The party still decided to go with Taft because of the institutional power he had. So, Teddy Roosevelt runs as a third-party candidate as part of the Progressive Party, but also known as the Bull Moose Party. So in the way that the Republicans have the elephant, the Democrats have the donkey, he said that a moose would be his party's mascot because, like him, it was a very robust, strong, and kind of scary animal. All right? So what happens, though, in the election of 1912 is Taft and Roosevelt split the vote. So basically, if only one of them had run, one of them would have won. But instead what happens is the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, instead wins the presidency because he was able to have a plurality of the the vote, even though Taft and Roosevelt could have won it on their own. Okay? Now, Wilson is often seen as the last of the progressive presidents. He continues most of those same policies, but because of World War I and changes in the 1920s, we're going to see a big shift when that happens. All right? Another thing about Wilson, and this gets to that idea of restricted immigration policies, as well as those views on segregation, is Wilson was probably one of our most sort of openly racist presidents. Now, of course, this is the era of Jim Crow, but what you need to know about Wilson is he was from the South. He grew up in that environment of white supremacy and Jim Crow. He openly supported the KKK's efforts during Reconstruction. He wrote a whole book about it. This movie called Birth of a Nation comes out, which is basically the first full-length feature movie ever made about how the KKK saved white Southerners from sort of this black menace during Reconstruction. And Wilson had a private viewing in the White House and said, "This is the best thing I've ever seen, and the thing is, it's all true." Okay? I might be able to show you some clips of that in class if you'd like to see those. It's a pretty horrible movie, but it's pretty revealing about the era. Something he did with his presidential power is he fired all blacks that had federal positions. The president has a lot of power to appoint and fire people in various federal jobs around the country. And previous institutions in the progressive movement had tried to integrate it a little bit more. Taft and Roosevelt had done that. Wilson comes in and says, nope, I'm going to replace them all with white people. Okay? So you can see, this is the idea of how the progressive movement is a bit of a mixed bag. Yes, it did have a significant effect on more popular participation in government, on regulating the economy, but at the same time, it has its limitations. Was it just making government more efficient? Yeah. Was it preserving Jim Crow? Yeah, it was doing that too. So it's a step forward, but not necessarily 2 steps forward. All right, thank you so much for watching. You know what your next steps are. Create some cards, 1 for each slide, red or yellow terms. You've got a quiz to do by 8 a.m. You've got some geography and chronology to take care of, and always a next video to watch to get ahead. Realize that the next video is not going to be the next number on the concept outline. It's going to be the one labeled number 2 at the beginning. All right? So this is Mr. Chodola signing off. Thank you for watching as always, and I will see you in class. Bye.